The face is, after all, the primary social stimulus. It's the point of contact between infant and caregiver. It's the channel by which we get information about other people's identities and by which we get information about their emotional states and all that kind of stuff. If there's anything social that deserves a dedicated module in the brain, it's the face. Okay, that's really all that has to be said about that. If there isn't a face module in the brain, there's probably not any other kind of social module. And as I said, we're going to skip this. As I said before, there does appear to be, Wisher and her colleagues appear to have identified a particular area of the brain that seems to be dedicated to the processing of this primary social stimulus, the face. Some evidence along these lines is neuropsychological evidence. It comes from cases of brain damage, and especially a particular form of brain damage known as visual object agnosia. Agnosias really are failures of semantic memory, if you will. A person with visual object agnosia can describe an object that's presented to him or her visually, but they can't name the object, they can't identify the object, they don't recognize the object as familiar, and they typically can't demonstrate how the object is going to be used. Visual object agnosia is nicely characterized as percepts that are just percepts. They're percepts that have been stripped of meaning, which is why we call it an agnosia. Well, it turns out that there's a particular form of visual object agnosia, which is quite interesting to social psychologists, and it's known as prosopagnosia, a neurological condition that was first described by Walter Bonhoeffer in 1947, and this appears to involve a specific deficit in recognizing faces. These patients have the ability to, they can certainly see the face. You know, if you put a face in front of them and say, is there an object there, they say yes. If you ask them to describe the face, they can do that. If it's a color photograph, they can say, well, the person has blue eyes, and the person has red hair, and the person has freckles, and all these kinds of things. However, what they can't do is they can't put a name to the face. They can't tell you who the person is, even if the face belongs to a person who ought to be familiar to them. And there are some cases of this where the difficulty of recognizing faces occurs in the context of visual object agnosia in general, which is they can't recognize anything else either. But there are, what Bonner was interested in were some cases where there's a pure deficit in facial recognition. The person has no ability to identify familiar faces, that is, faces that should be familiar, doesn't have a feeling of familiarity, but can recognize other kinds of objects. And what Bonner discovered on autopsy, we let these patients die and then you look at their brains, is that, no, you don't let them die, right? Everybody dies, right? You don't kill them for this purpose. You just let them die, you wait for them to die, and then you get hold of their brains. And what Bonner discovered was that these patients who had a pure prosopagnosia, pure inability to recognize faces, had damage to a particular area, basically at the junction of the temporal and occipital lobes. Brodmann's areas 18, 19, and 37. There's 37, there's 18, there's 19. Damage is right in there. Okay, leading some individuals to suggest that this is a face area, a part of the brain that is specifically geared to recognizing faces. And later research has shown that even with neurologically intact subjects, if you ask subjects to identify faces as opposed to other kinds of objects, you'll see activation in this area as well. It was that kind of evidence, in fact, that led Wisher and her colleagues to identify this area as it's known as the fusiform gyrus, as a fusiform face area. As with the self, however, this turns out to be not quite as easy as you'd like it to be. Here's another depiction of where this area is. Here's the occipital lobe, here's the temporal lobe. There's a little notch here, okay, and the fusiform area is basically here. There's area 30, Brodmann's area 37, 18, and 19. So, and it kind of makes sense that that's where you'd find an area for recognizing faces, because as you know, the occipital cortex has a lot to do with visual processing. Temporal lobe has a lot to do with memory processing. Recognizing faces, got to connect up what you see with what you remember, and it kind of makes sense that if there were going to be a face area, you'd find it there. And as I say, because if there's any module in the brain for any kind of social task, there ought to be one for face recognition. The idea that this is a face area, a part of the brain that's specifically dedicated to identifying faces, makes a great deal of sense and was kind of quickly and almost universally accepted as the identification of a particular social module. Yes? Yeah. Well, that might be the case, okay, but you have to be careful. People with, we know that the hypothalamus regulates eating, but people with eating disorders don't have damaged hypothalami. They don't have shrunken or expanded hypothalami. And in general, it's not easy to correlate brain size with ability. For example, Albert Einstein's brain looks just like everybody else's brain. We know that because UC Berkeley's own Marion Diamond did the histology on Einstein's brain, and what she found was that he had a lot more glial cells than average, but not a lot more neurons. We do know that when people get very good at something, the anatomy of the brain changes in certain respects. Okay, so if you become a really good violin player, the areas of the brain that especially mediate the left, the finger area, they get bigger. Not more neurons, but more connections. Okay, so it might make sense that if there really were people who never forget a face, and they really don't, okay, we might find that this particular area was larger. That's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. To my knowledge, unless somebody wants to correct me, which is okay, to my knowledge, that study has never been done. But you might also find it someplace else. For example, we know, or we think we know, almost everybody agrees, that memories aren't located in any particular place. So it's not as if the person has all those memories stored there and it just has to get big like your filing cabinet in your desk. But if you're particularly good at something, that part of the area might be better. But it turns out that the issue turns out to be much more complicated than that, in part because, again, there are difficulties with the demonstration that prosopagnosia involves a specific deficit in recognizing faces. And the problem here is kind of subtle, but it looks like this. What Bottomer would do would be to present one of his patients with a picture of a person who should be familiar to them and say, do you know who this is? And the patients would say, no. They'd say, well, can you describe the person? Yes, he's young and he's male and he's got short cropped hair and he's got dark complexion and stuff like that. Do you know who he is? No, I don't know what he is. I don't know who he is. Then Bottomer would present a picture of a non-face object like a house and say, do you know what this is? And the person would say, it's a house. Now, if you think about it for a little bit, those are two very, very different questions. okay, who is this, asks you to identify the object at a specific level of categorization known as the subordinate level of categorization. It's not enough to say, oh, it's a black guy, okay, or even, oh, he must be a government official, otherwise he wouldn't have the American flag in the background or anything like that. But the question, what is this, can be answered at what's known as the basic level of categorization, which is to say, it's a house. Just because the person can identify a house as a house, but can't identify Barack Obama as Barack Obama, doesn't mean that the person has a specific deficit in recognizing faces. You've got to control the tasks for level of categorization. So what you really want to do is to ask, you know who this is? Okay? Do you know what that is? You can only claim that there's a specific deficit in identifying familiar faces if the control task is also requires you to identify a specific object at the same level of categorization. And the question is, do prosopagnosia patients who don't identify this person correctly also fail to identify that object correctly, to say that's the White House? Okay? Well, it turns out that many prosopagnosia patients can't identify the White House as the White House. Okay? So it doesn't look like a particularly specific area that's geared towards face identification. It looks more like this area of the cortex around the so-called fusiform area seems to be involved in identifying objects of any sort, whether they're faces or people or houses or whatever, at a particular level of categorization, at the subordinate level of categorization that involves identifying specific instances. The person who noticed this, by the way, just so you had some inspiration for those of you who are going on to graduate school, those of you who are in graduate school, was a graduate student, Isabelle Gautier, who's now a professor at Vanderbilt University, who got interested in, she's a vision scientist, a cognitive neuroscientist, who got interested in this problem, and all of a sudden she just kind of noticed this one day, that there was this problem with these tasks, and then set off for her doctoral dissertation to correct the issue. It was Gautier, in fact, who discovered that many prosopagnosia patients can't identify objects, non-face objects, at the subordinate level of classification either. But most of her work, let's do this, right, most of her work had to do with imaging the brains of people as they perform particular kinds of tests. Most of these studies were PET imaging studies. Some of them were fMRI studies. That detail doesn't matter. But in one of her early studies, for example, she took subjects and asked them, showed them pictures of various kinds, and asked them to make categorization judgments at two different levels of categorization. Either a basic level of categorization, asking them, putting up a picture of a bird and saying, is this a bird or not? Or a subordinate level of categorization, where you put up a picture of a bird and you ask the subjects, is this a pelican or not? And what she discovered was that this task, which is not a social task, doesn't involve face stimuli or anything else that's particularly social, also recruits the fusiform area. Okay? That when you make judgments about objects at the subordinate level of categorization, that task activates the fusiform area, regardless of whether you are recognizing faces or you're recognizing other kinds of objects. In another series of studies, she actually took college students who were not experts in a particular area, and then over a long period of time, she actually hired them as work-study students, taught them to become experts in classifying various kinds of objects. Classifying cars, is this a car? Is this a Buick Riviera? Okay. Birds, is this a bird or is it a pelican? She also trained some subjects to become experts in classifying snowflakes. It turns out snowflakes come in 7 kinds. You didn't know that, did you? Okay. Snowflakes come in 7 kinds. There are 7 broad categories of snowflakes. And if you really work at it, you can become an expert in classifying snowflakes, so that when you see something like this, you can tell what kind of snowflake it is. She taught other subjects to classify fingerprints, okay, to recognize individual fingerprints at the subordinate level of categorization. And she also taught subjects to recognize wholly artificial objects known as greebles. These were objects that were developed in the laboratory of her dissertation advisor, Mike Tarr. They're kind of sort of face-like, but not really. But the really nice thing about these greebles is that they come in what are known as races, genders, and ages, depending on things like whether the body is fat or thin, or whether the ears go up or down, or whether the nose is long or short, or whatever. But what she did was to teach subjects to classify these objects that all pretty much look the same to us. But after a couple of months of training, you become very, very, very good at this. Okay? And what she discovered was that as subjects became experts in categorizing these non-social objects, fingerprints, snowflakes, automobiles, birds, greebles, they progressively more and more recruited this fusiform area, so that when they became experts in subordinate level classification, they used the fusiform area to make these kinds of judgments. Here's some more greebles. They're kind of cool. Right? And you just kind of look at them, you kind of get a sense that they come in different types, and they do. I'm not a greeble expert, so I can't tell you what they are. Body shape, okay, and then the orientation of their parts, whether they go up or down, and all that. Those are the basic categories of greeble stimuli. But the point here is that there's nothing face-specific about the fusiform area. The fusiform area is activated whenever people make classification judgments at a particular level of categorization, what's known as the subordinate level of categorization, where you have to distinguish pelican from non-pelican among birds, Barack Obama from non-Barack Obama among males, male greebles versus female greebles, and so on and so forth. That's what the fusiform area seems to do. That's just more of this. Okay, there's a snowflake study. There's also a face study here where people are classifying faces as male or female or white and black. Same thing. This task obviously activates the fusiform area, but so does classifying snowflakes. Leading Isabelle Gautier and her advisor Mike Tarr to suggest that the fusiform area is not dedicated to faces, but rather is dedicated to a much broader kind of cognitive task, classifying objects at particular levels of categorization, subordinate levels of classification, pelicans, robins, sparrows, greebles of particular kinds, Buicks as opposed to automobiles, and so on. And that the fusiform area, far from being dedicated and specifically geared to recognizing faces, actually is quite flexible in terms of what it operates on. It looks like an area dedicated to specifically dedicated to faces, because recognizing faces is a really good example of subordinate level classification. What we do when we recognize somebody's face is familiar, or we put a name to a face, or we recognize somebody's voice is familiar, arguably, or put a name to a voice, is we classify it not just as a face or a human face or whatever, but we classify it as somebody's face. Okay, the point of this is neuropsychology and neuroscience, brain imaging, studies of brain damaged patients of all sorts, can help us to identify parts of the brain that are specifically dedicated to particular social cognitive tasks. In fact, if you want to know the answer to that question, you have to do neuroimaging. That's basically what it's really good for. But before you can do the neuroimaging, you have to know what you're looking for. There has to be a theory that suggests to you what kinds of tasks might be performed by dedicated modules. And before you can find that dedicated module in the brain, you have to have an experimental task that actually taps that theoretical process. In this way, as in all other ways, I think, psychology drives the neuroscience, not the other way around. That's what I mean when I say that neuroscience without psychology is just neuroscience. It's a science that tells us what neurons look like and how they function chemically, but it doesn't tell us what they do. For that, we need a psychological theory. Okay, next week we'll look at the development of social cognitive functions. I'll have some things to say about autism, but I'll also have some things to say about chimpanzees. See you then. Have a good weekend.